Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we retell the old Scots folk and fairy tales so that they will never be forgotten. Today, I'm going to tell a story from the Orkney Islands called Peerifool. The tale continues my unintentional trend in recent episodes of female-focused stories, and it's one which I first heard in the story tent of a music festival long ago. So, without further ado, let's sit back and start the story of Peerifool. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, there was a good king and queen on the Isle of Rossi, which lies just north of Orkney, and they had 3 daughters. These 3 princesses were the pride of their mother and father, and each was as lovely as the other. However, when the 3 girls were just grown into young maidens, the good king sadly died, and the crown passed to a distant cousin, who had always disliked the king, and whose first act upon taking the throne was to cast out the widowed queen and her 3 daughters. So, the queen sold what little jewellery she had to buy a small cottage far from the castle, and here she lived with her 3 daughters in mild poverty. It was a real riches to rags situation, but the queen and the 3 princesses did their best with what they now had. They had a small kale yard outside the cottage and a grazing field for the 1 cow which they kept. A kale yard was a small vegetable plot, usually used for growing cabbages or kale. The queen and the 2 older princesses took to domestic tasks and farming reluctantly, but the younger princess relished in the hard work. She had always been the boldest and the least fussy of the 3 girls, often slipping out of the castle when she was a child to go and play with the village children, while her sisters remained in the castle, learning fine embroidery and polite etiquette. What money they made came from selling the extra milk from their 1 cow, which they kept fed on the cabbages grown in the kale yard. Apparently, cows fed on cabbage give particularly good milk. After some time, they realised that someone had begun coming at night and stealing the cabbages from the kale yard. This vexed the former queen and her daughters greatly, for if they didn't have enough cabbages to feed the cow, then it would produce less milk and they'd be unable to sell the excess. The eldest princess decided that she would take a stool outside and sit wrapped in a blanket one night to watch the kale yard and try to catch the thief. So she did just that, and for hours it seemed that her watch would be in vain, for nothing happened for a long, long time, and the princess was about ready to give up, when suddenly she heard strange, slow noises of movement coming towards the cottage. Suddenly she saw a great giant stealthily step over the high wall of the kale yard. He was at least twice the height of a normal man, with huge, thick arms and legs. He carried a great creel in one arm and had a knife in the other hand as long as a claymore. A claymore was a huge 2-handed longsword used by Highlanders from the 15th to the 17th century. And a creel, as we've mentioned before, was a large woven wicker basket. The giant began using his huge knife to cut the cabbages and throw them into the creel which was slung over his arm. You might think that the proper reaction to this from the princess would be terror. It was, after all, a huge, scary giant with a knife almost as long as she was tall. But the girl had been raised as royalty, and she had the self-importance of the truly noble. She also had the aristocratic sense of self-preservation, which is about equal to that of a suicidal moth in a church full of candles. So she stood up from her stool and yelled at the giant, "Hey, you! Who gave you liberty to cut our cabbages? Leave off this minute and go away!" The giant completely ignored the princess and went on quietly cutting the cabbages and filling his creel. The princess, unaccustomed to being ignored, was livid, and stamping her foot on the ground, she shouted, "Dost thou not hear me, you great lout?" The giant stopped and turned to face the small girl. He looked at her for a few moments and then said, "If thou dost not shut up, I will take thee as well." "Ha!" retorted the princess. "I should very much like to see you try." The giant looked at the young princess again, and with the ease that one might lift a rag doll, he picked her up by her arm and stuffed her into his creel with the cabbages, and then he closed the wicker lid. Then he carried her off along with his stolen booty. The giant's home was in a huge square house on a desolate moor. When he got there, he lifted the princess out and tossed her onto the floor. "Thou wilt now be my servant," he said. "Keep my house and do my errands for me. I has a cow which thou must drive to the hillside every morn to graze. Then, when thou comes back, there is housework to do. Here is a bag o' wool, which must be combed and carded and spun into yarn, then woven into a thick cloth for me clothing. I be out for most of the day. When I comes hame, I shall expect this done, and a great pot o' porridge boiled for my supper." The princess was more disheartened by the prospect of having to do domestic chores than she had been by her kidnapping. She was unused to hard work. Even at the cottage, she'd always had her younger sister to help with any manual labour that needed doing. But the giant paid no heed to her dismay, and as soon as it was daylight, he went out to do whatever it was that he did during the day. Perhaps sell stolen cabbages. As soon as he was gone, the princess drove the cow to pasture, as instructed, but then she took a walk on the moor to see if she could tell where she was. It was no use, though. She didn't recognise any of the landscape, even in the far distance, so escape seemed pointless. By the time she got back to the giant's house, she was exhausted and dejected. She decided to put on the pot of porridge and break her fast before she began to comb, card, and spin the bag of wool. Just as she sat down with a bowl of porridge, the back door opened, and a crowd of wee fairy folk came trooping into the kitchen. They were the smallest people that the princess had ever seen. Not one of them would reach halfway to her knee. The wee folk were dressed in clothes which seemed made from all the colours of the rainbow and which shimmered in the light, and all of them had hair as yellow as fresh straw. The little fairies crowded into the room, laughing and scrambling up the stools and chairs until they were gathered about her on the kitchen table. One of the wee folk stepped forward and said in a high-pitched and sing-song voice, "Thou hast milk and porridge oats. Spare a wee bit for the fairy folks." The princess was tired and hungry, and more than a little cross. She had no want to share her meagre breakfast with a group of hungry fairies, so she waved her wooden spoon at them and sharply said, "Little for one and less for two, and never a grain have I for you." To her great relief, for she was not at all happy with the group of fairies all standing on the table staring at her, as soon as she said the words, the wee folk vanished, as if they had never been there. Her breakfast ordeal over, the princess finished her porridge and set about combing and carding the bag of wool. However, she quickly despaired at the task, for the wool seemed as though it was bewitched. It tangled and curled around her fingers as she tried to comb it, and no matter what she did, it twisted back into a matted clump. When the giant returned, it was to find the princess sitting hopelessly on the floor with the tangled wool all about her. To make matters worse, she'd been so focused on the cursed wool that she had allowed the porridge in the pot to burn to a cinder on the cook fire. The giant, whose base level of emotion was already several stages past grumpy, was absolutely furious. He raged at the princess, scolding and shouting at her. He picked her up by her heels with one hand, and with the other he whipped her back until she was skinned and bleeding. Then he carried her out to the cowshed and tossed her up onto one of the roof beams. The princess was so stunned from the beating that she couldn't move a muscle, and lay motionless on the joist where the giant had thrown her. That evening the giant went off again to steal more cabbages. Back at the cottage, the second princess had decided to sit out and watch the kale-yard as her sister had done the previous night. She seems unconcerned that not only had her sister failed to prevent the disappearance of the cabbages, but had in fact vanished along with them. And so, the exact same thing happens to the second princess as happened to the first. The giant steals her, along with the cabbages, and takes her to his home. She despairs at the prospect of domestic servitude, but reluctantly puts the cow to pasture and sits down to break her fast with a bowl of porridge. When the fairy folk turn up in the kitchen, she refuses to share with them, and they vanish into thin air. Like her sister before her, she is unable to comb and card the wool, and the giant, when he returns, beats her and tosses her onto a roof beam in the cowshed next to her sister, who is still lying up there, unable to move. Meanwhile, the third and youngest princess had decided to take watch over the kale-yard that night. She is less concerned about the cabbages and more concerned about the disappearance of her two sisters. When the giant comes, she goads him into kidnapping her so that she can find them. She's not worried about the giant because she is a brave and smart young girl, and is fairly confident that wherever she ends up, she'll be quite capable of outwitting a giant. The giant tips the third princess onto the floor of his home and explains that she must now work for him, taking the cow to pasture and cleaning the house, and then combing and carding and weaving the bag of wool, and also have his supper of porridge ready when he comes back. Unlike her two sisters, the third princess is not in the least bit daunted by this. She's used to doing most of the work at the cottage anyway, and to the giant's surprise, she cheerfully agrees to do everything that the giant has asked of her. First, just as her sisters had done, she drives the cow to pasture in the morning. But unlike her sisters, she hurries straight back to the giant's home to begin her other work. She makes herself a bowl of porridge and some milk and sits down to breakfast. Before she's swallowed her first spoonful, the troop of fairies come crowding into the kitchen and clamber up onto the table. One steps forward and in a high-pitched voice asks, "Thou hast milk and porridge oats. Spare a wee bit for the fairy folks." The third princess is a far kinder and gentler young girl than her two older sisters, and she says to the wee fairies, "There's plenty of porridge in the pot, and I'll gladly share what I have got. But, my little fairy souls, you'll have to find some tiny bowls. This one is just fine for me, but it's far too big for all o' thee. It would be a tearful sin if you were to be falling in." The fairies all laughed at this and rolled about the table. Then, quick as a flash, they hopped onto the floor and out the back door, only to return a few moments later, holding cups of foxgloves and bluebells and saucers of primroses. The princess put a tiny spoonful of porridge into each primrose saucer and a thimbleful of milk into each foxglove cup. The fairies ate and drank quickly. Then, crying, "Thank you, thank you," they all bustled out of the back door again, leaving the princess alone to finish her own bowl. When she was done, she raised the porridge pot higher to reduce the heat, and then searched the giant's house for signs of her sisters. But she could find no trace of them, although she did find a lot of gold, silver, and jewels, which the giant was hoarding. The princess was not disheartened at not finding her sisters yet, and she planned to search the outhouses the next day. She knew she had to work the wool before the giant returned. As soon as she sat down with the bag of wool, though, another of the fairy folk came into the kitchen. He looked much like the others had, except he was slightly taller and dressed in even more shimmering clothes. He walked boldly up to the princess and asked, "Hast thou any work that thou needs done? Wool, perhaps, that could be spun?" The princess looked at the little man and said, "I have a whole bag of wool here that needs combing and carding and spinning, but I have naught to pay thee with, and there are few folk in this world who would work for free." The little fairy laughed and said, "A wager, then, a wager! I'll have the wool all spun for free, if thee can guess the name o' me. If thee can guess, then all be fine, but if thee canna, then the wool be mine." The princess thought that it could be no hard thing to guess the fairy's name, so she agreed, and the little man hefted the large bag onto his back with ease, and was off out the door quick as a mouse. The princess ran to the door to see where he went, for she had it in mind to go and spy on him, and perhaps learn his name. But by the time she opened the door he was nowhere to be seen. While the afternoon wore on, and the princess went about the general cleaning of the giant's house, she began to regret her decision. She had, after all, just given the giant's wool to a strange little fairy, with no reason to believe that he would actually come back. She worried what the giant might do if he returned and the wool was just gone. As the sun began to set and evening set in, there was a knock at the door. When the princess opened it, she found an old woman begging for a night's shelter from the cold wind. The princess told the woman that she was only a servant in this house, and she had no say in who could or couldn't stay there. She was also unsure how the giant would react to her giving lodgings to a random old woman. However, she was a kind-hearted soul, and she insisted that before the woman left she come inside and rest and eat some porridge. She also brought the woman a basin of warm water to soothe her tired feet, and gave her a few bannocks to take with her. Before she left, the old woman blessed the princess for her kindness and told her not to worry, as it was a dry evening, and now that she had a meal inside her, she could easily lie down in a sheltered spot somewhere for the night. The old woman went and found shelter in the lee of a small grass-covered green hill not far from the giant's house. When she pulled her shawl around her and lay down, she felt the ground of the hill become warmer and warmer. Eventually, she became so hot that she climbed up the hill to cool down in the evening wind. As she climbed, she began to hear voices from somewhere, singing. "Tease, teasins, tease the wool, card, cardins, card the wool, spin, spinnins, spin the wool, for the king named Peerifool. Tease, teasins, tease the wool, card, cardins, card the wool, spin, spinnins, spin the wool, for the king named Peerifool." The singing grew louder as she neared the crest of the hill. At the top, the old woman found a crack in the earth, through which light was spilling out into the dark evening air. She peered into the crack and saw a brilliantly lit chamber beneath the ground. Inside, all the wee fairy folk were gathered in a circle and working away as hard as they could. Some were combing the wool, and some were carding the wool. Some were spinning it into yarn. One fairy, who looked a little larger than the rest, was dancing around the circle and cracking a small whip, encouraging the wee folk to work faster and faster. This was a strange sight, to be sure, thought the old woman as she crept back down the grassy hill. She decided to go back and tell the bonny young lassie who had shown her such kindness what she had seen. She reasoned the knowledge might stand her in good stead some day. After all, fairies are tricksy creatures, and it is very well to be on one's guard when they are about. The princess was delighted by the old woman's news, since now she kenned what the name of the fairy must be. She was so happy that she risked the wrath of the giant by allowing the old woman to sleep in the peat shed for the night. Not long after the old woman had gone to lay in the peat shed, the back door of the house opened, and in walked the fairy, with the bag over his shoulder. Not only had the wool been combed, carded, and spun, it had also been woven into cloth of shimmering colours, much like the fairies wore themselves. The fairy put the cloth on the table and smiled up at the princess. "Here be thy wool, thou bonny dame. Now canst thou but guess my name?" The princess said one name and then another, each time pretending to think that she might have guessed right. The fairy jumped from foot to foot on the table, laughing at her failures, and he delighted in the cloth that would soon be his. Giggling to himself, he said, "None of those are my true name, but keep on guessing all the same." At last, the princess grew tired of the game, and she cried out with a note of false despair, "Sad I am to lose my wool, unless thy name be Peerifool." The little fairy immediately stopped laughing and jumping. He knew that somehow the princess had outwitted him, but a bargain is a bargain. He stamped his foot on the table, and without another word turned and stormed out the back door. Feeling rather pleased with herself, the princess set the table ready for the giant's imminent return. When he came through the front door, it was to find the freshly woven cloth laid out, and his supper of porridge ready and waiting for him. The house was also clean and tidy, and the princess was standing smiling next to the kitchen table. The giant was immensely pleased at this, and he exclaimed, "By my troth, thou art a hard-working and industrious maiden, to be sure. As a reward for working so diligently, I shall return thy sisters to thee." True to his word, after the giant had eaten, he went to the cowshed and lifted down the princess's two sisters from where he had stowed them, and he brought them into the house. The princess nearly screamed aloud when she saw the sorry state that her wounded sisters were in, but she held her tongue until the giant had gone to bed, busying herself washing and dressing and bandaging their skinned and bloody backs. The giant woke in the early hours of the morning and left to steal more cabbages from the seemingly unlimited supply at the cottage. When he was gone, and her sisters were somewhat recovered, they told the young princess about all that had befallen them since their abduction. The princess was furious at the ill treatment that her sisters had endured, and with a look of burning determination on her face, she vowed, "Fear thou not, sisters. We shall be avenged on him for this cruelty." Then she explained to her sisters what she intended to do. When the giant returned at sunrise from stealing yet more cabbages from the cottage, the princess had his breakfast ready and laid out for him. While he ate, she told him that she had put her sisters to bed, for they were not yet recovered. When he went out for the day, she quickly completed all the housework that she had to do, and then she fetched the giant's creel. She lined the bottom of the basket with grass, and then placed much of his hoarded gold inside, along with one of her sisters. On top, she arranged yet more grass, so that nothing of the hidden contents could be seen. Later, while the giant was eating his supper, she boldly addressed him in her sweetest tone. "Art thou happy with the works I have done thee?" The giant replied that he was indeed. The princess continued, "Then wilt thou carry that creel full of grass with you to my mother's home tonight? It will help make up for all the cabbages which thou hast stolen from her kale yard." The giant was in excellent humour, and agreed to empty the grass by her mother's back door that night. The next day, the princess again lined the creel with grass, this time concealing many of the fine jewels which the giant had hoarded, along with her second sister, and covering the top with more grass. Again, the giant emptied the creel outside her mother's cottage that night. The next day, the princess went out to find the old beggar woman who had told her about the fairy's true name. This wasn't difficult, as the woman was still sleeping in the peat shed at night, unbeknownst to the giant. "Good lady," said the princess, "soon the giant that lives in yonder house shall be no more, and if thou wilt help me but a little, then the house and its contents shall be thine." When the old woman asked what it was that the princess wanted her to do, she said, "It is no big thing. Tonight simply lie in my bed in the house, with the linens pulled up over thee." The old woman agreed, and the princess set about preparing all the rest. Again she lined the creel with grass, this time placing the fine shimmering cloth that had been woven by the fairies inside. When the giant came home that day, his supper was ready, and again he agreed to empty the creel outside her mother's cottage. When he went to bed, the princess first prepared his breakfast so that it would be waiting for him when he woke. Then she hid herself inside the creel and pulled more grasses on top of her. In the early hours, when the giant arose, his breakfast was sitting out for him on the table, and the creel was by the back door, but there was no sign of the princess. He looked into her small bedroom and saw that she was sleeping soundly, with the linens pulled up over her. So he ate his porridge and set out for the cottage. As he had done the previous 2 nights, he crept up to the back door of the cottage to empty the creel out. However, the princess had told her sisters exactly what to do, and they were lying in wait for his arrival by an upstairs window. As soon as he approached the cottage, first one sister emptied a great pot of boiling water over his head, and then the other sister dropped a huge quernstone on him, flattening him and killing him dead. That was the end of the giant, and the end of the queen and her daughter's sorrows and poverty, since now they had gold and jewels aplenty taken from the giant's house. They also had the finest clothing in all the land, made from the fairy-woven cloth. So the 4 women lived long and happy and easy lives. Back at the giant's house, the old beggar woman woke to find an empty house, which still held a large amount of gold, silver, and jewels, for the princess had been unable to fit them all in the creel. The beggar woman never forgot the young princess, who she never saw again, but she too lived a long and happy and easy life. So, that's the end of the folktale Peerifool. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a comment or hit the thumbs up for a wee like. Thank you all for joining me, and I very much hope to see you next story.